Hello again. It has been quite a while, hasn't it? I've been rather busy, and I'll confess this hasn't been the first thing on my mind. Um, I'm aware that we have some new people listening in. Hello and thank you, and I hope you'll stick around. So, recently, what have I been thinking about? I've been thinking about what it means for a piece of literature to come from a certain nation or to be referred to as, national literature. So, insert, say, Greek or Japanese, English, and so on here. Because I was reading David Mitchell, actually. I looked at Number 9 Dream. And, I had fun with it. It wasn't particularly deep. It's not something that I would call, you know, the best of all time or anything like that. But hey, not bad, just not excellent. There's better stuff out there. But the reason I'm choosing to talk about this and the reason it kept my attention is because it's filled with it's trying very hard to be a Japanese novel, despite the fact that it was written in English by an Englishman. And I say it's trying very hard because it's making mentions of all sorts of Japanese stuff. It's sort of dropping names everywhere, Sei Shonagon and the myth of Urashima Taro, and all of this very Japanese stuff, very classic stuff, pretty constantly. But you can still tell that it's English and it's written by an English person through a couple of telltale things. And I don't just mean something as nebulous and hard to define as the style, although having read a pile of Japanese books about as long as my forearm, I can tell you that there is something going on with the style, but I'm not good enough and not experienced enough to tell quite what it is. But I can tell you that you can tell it's written by an Englishman because the names are all the wrong way around. In Japanese, you probably know that they put the surname first, and David Mitchell does the opposite. He does it the Western way. And it reminds me of a reverse Haruki Murakami, as in the wrong Murakami, yes. But it reminds me of the reverse of him because Haruki Murakami just tends to talk about a lot of Western stuff. All of his characters listen to the same kind of jazz, and they all eat Italian foods, and so on and so on. So it's the exact thing in reverse, isn't it? By the way, when I say the wrong Murakami, I'm talking about the fact that nobody has heard of Ryu Murakami, who is far better than Haruki, because he's apparently much harder to get into, although I didn't see that myself, but that's a discussion for another time. But it was because of reading Number 9 Dream that I started thinking about what it meant for a piece of literature to have come from a certain nation and what that actually meant. Because several months ago, I read a book called Scandinavians, just Scandinavians, pretty shit title, but there you go, by a guy named Robert Ferguson. And he made it his goal during this book to discover what he called the soul of the North. In other words, he wanted to get into the cultural mindset. He wanted the mentality. And when I say mentality, I mean it in the sense that, let me explain from the beginning, right? In the 1920s, there was a movement in historical schools in France that kind of combined together and formed something that they called the Annales School, because they wrote in a journal called the Annales du something something da da da. And the Annales School of historians mainly tended to focus on things through cultural lens. They wrote cultural histories, and they looked at history through the lens of mentalities of or underlying mindsets, frameworks, how people thought about the world around them and how that characterized what they said, what they thought, and what they did. And this Scandinavians book is not a work by a French historian, and it's not in that style at all. But it strikes me that it should have been in that style, because he would have got a bit further towards answering his question, what is the soul of the North, by looking at it like a Frenchman would. Anyway, that's not really the point either. What I was really trying to get to by mentioning Soul of the North is the idea that David Mitchell is trying to capture the soul of a country that he doesn't belong to, just like Robert Ferguson was. And I wondered how you could do that. So I started thinking about literature that came from a certain country. And I came up with the criteria that we would normally think of to denote literature as having come from a certain country, right? So we say, okay, point one, it's written in a certain language. So Russian literature is written in Russian, right? But there's a counter to that, and that's Lolita. Now you might think, okay, well, for it to be a piece of national literature, it has to be written in the national language, right? That's the most important criterion. But would you call Lolita an English novel or a Russian novel? Because Nabokov's Russian and he decided to write the novel in English. Maybe that one's a bad example because it's a fairly cosmopolitan thing, because Nabokov's a fairly cosmopolitan guy. But I feel like that still serves as a counter. So I thought, okay, what's the second criterion? What if it's produced by a member of insert culture or race here? So again, Lolita is Russian because Nabokov is Russian. Or Number 9 Dream by David Mitchell is an English novel because David Mitchell is English. But I couldn't find a counter for that. So maybe that's where the line's supposed to be drawn. Maybe that's one acceptable or admissible criterion. Okay, the third one. If it has been produced in the geographical location, which is honestly pretty relevant, that's not great because there have been plenty of books that belonged to one culture that were written somewhere else. All that matters is that the author stayed in their home country long enough to understand the mentality and input that into the work, right? What's next? The topic of, the book's topic. The topic needs to deal with the nation or something that happened to the nation or a national problem. But there's a counter to that. If the plot of the book happens to happen in that nation, but the location doesn't really matter, then it's not national in any sense beyond how the cultures inform the writer unconsciously. And as my example for that counter, I pulled up every genre fiction novel that didn't necessarily need to happen inside whatever country it was written in. So there's Keigo Higashino's Devotion of Suspect X, there's Stanislav Lem's Solaris. Those are genre fiction, so maybe they don't count. More in the vein of literature, there's stuff like J.M. Coetzee's Childhood of Jesus, Natsume Soseki's I Am a Cat, everything written by Kazuo Ishiguro, which, by the way, is still somehow uniquely English, even if the topics that he writes about are universal. I guess there's also Nut Hampson to an extent. Things like Hunger and Growth of the Soil and Mysteries aren't necessarily Norwegian at all. They're much more universal than that, and that's because they're writing literature, proper capital L literature on universal themes with a Nordic outlook. Maybe that's criterion 4.5. But we've got to move on to number 5. And number 5, I thought, was less having the book's events happen inside the nation, and more having the topic be a literal or an allegorical exploration of a unique national problem. And maybe there's a hard counter. I think writers who become famous tend to set the tone of the pop culture and the discourse, and thus the culture's idea of itself in retrospect. Although, obviously, those things are extremely mutable and their perceptions are pretty changeable. Excuse me. Because of things like journalism and so 24/7 news cycles, that's the kind of mindset, what a society thinks of itself, that never stays the same for long. And so writers who go through the sort of rigmarole of getting properly published, they tend to solidify those perceptions in stone more than a clickbait article. And obviously it helps that time has usually got plenty of itself to pass between the events and the recollection. So I don't have any really concrete examples for this, but I was thinking of Aboriginal novels about the British colonies and African American novels about the United States, conflicts that only exist in certain places and certain times. I mean, Japan's 1980s in literature is a distinct period which I could have written a thesis about, but I chose not to. But I think that that period in literature, even the stuff that wouldn't necessarily clarify as Japanese literature, still exhibits the qualities of Japanese literature because it's dealing unconsciously or consciously with those central problems that they were having at that time in that place and nowhere else. Or if it was happening in other places, it was happening in a markedly different way. So I suppose that's all I had to say about that. I'm not quite sure what conclusions I would come to, but I suppose I'll leave that to somebody with more experience than me. I'm really just here to ask questions more than anything else. And on that note, I do have a few bits of housekeeping. Specifically, what do I have? Oh, there it is. I don't have a script here. I only have notes, and I'm sort of scrolling back up and down. So, yes, for Orpheus. On macaronic literature, I have a Greek book for you from the turn of the century. It's called Iphonissa, English The Murderess. You can find a translation by Peter Levi for New York Review of Books. And it's pretty much a very, very short, very Greek version of Crime and Punishment, where an old lady stranded on a crap, out-of-the-way Greek island kills young girls in order to save their parents the economic burden of having to raise them when money's tight and resources are sparse and hardly anyone can survive to adulthood. But it's an interesting novel, not just because of the topic, but because of how it's written. And I say that because in the early 20th century, and for quite a while before that, there were actually two Greek languages. There was Demotic Greek, which is, I mean, look at the word root, demos, people, right? The Greek of the people, so it's like pleb language, right? It's sort of ordinary Greek, and it's closest to what Greek people speak today. And there was Katharevousa, and Katharevousa, or clean or classical or pure Greek, is the stuff that you hear in all the Orthodox church rituals. And they actually still do speak that in like official church documentation. And for quite a while, Greece was split between using these two dialects, right? And it's a lot like the division between like Latin and Old English, right? You could think of it like that, I suppose, although it is a bit different. But hey, close enough, right? And what's fun about The Murderess by Alexandros Papadiamandis, and I'll stick the spelling in the description because, to hell with that. I know how it sounds when I speak Greek and when I pronounce these names. I know it's ridiculous, so I'll just put it in writing. And the fun thing about this book is that it's set on like a terrible, out-of-the-way rural island, right? Skiathos, which is like the backwater to end all backwaters. So obviously they're going to speak some like crap rural dialect that isn't spoken anywhere else in Greece. And if you were going to write that, you'd have to write mostly in Demotic Greek and then put the sort of dialectic markers and things and change up a few of the words depending on how differently they spoke. But the way that Alexandros Papadiamandis writes, right, is that he writes in Demotic Greek, and this is not easy to explain, so I'm sorry, but he writes in using Demotic Greek language, but with the linguistic structure of Katharevousa. So it's impossible to translate this, which is the problem, because I'm trying to explain to you how strange this book is, and I can barely read the silly thing myself, and I can barely explain it because there's no English equivalent. It's like writing in colloquial English with the structure of Latin. And it's incredibly bizarre, and it's almost impossible to render in modern English, so good luck with that. But I thought that I'd turn you on to that anyway, because you've spoken about it before, and I thought, hey, why not? That's what this platform is for, right? Sharing the knowledge. And I thought, where is it? I'd read out a paragraph just to end the video on, because I've got nothing better to end it on, and, well, why on earth not, yes? So I'll just do a paragraph, and then we'll finish up, because I think I've wasted enough time. Excuse me. Old Hadula, sometimes known as Yanis Frankisa, lay beside the hearth, with her eyes closed and her head resting on the step of the fireplace, the cinder step, as it's known. She had not dozed off. She was giving up her sleep at the cradle of her sick granddaughter. As for the new mother, who had given birth to the sick child, she had been sound asleep for a little while now in her unhappy nest on the floor. The little hanging lamp guttered under the canopy of the fireplace. It threw shadows instead of light on the few miserable sticks of furniture, which looked cleaner and grander at night than in the daytime. The 3 half-burnt logs and the big upright bulk of timber in the hearth made a lot of ash, a few glowing cinders, and a flame that crackled quietly and reminded the old woman through her drowsiness of her absent younger daughter Crinio. If Crinio had been in the house now, she would have been whispering in a low chant, "If he's a friend, good luck to him, and if he isn't,